Saki Santorelli, welcome to this workman's shed here in the middle of Denmark.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Anders.
Every week we do a weekly program on National Radio from here where we talk about existential questions, and I'm very happy that you could come here today.
I'm pleased and honored to be invited.
You know, Saki, this morning when I woke up, the whole field was filled with mist. It was so beautiful. And then slowly, as the sun came out and it all warmed up, the mist sort of disappeared and a landscape came into sight. And you could start sort of exploring the landscape. Now, if you look into the world and slowly let the mist of the world disappear, well, what kind of world do you see?
I grew up in part of my life as a boy was in Japan, and I came to really appreciate the mist in the mountains and the way it was often depicted in both Chinese and Japanese art as part of the landscape rather than as a way of obscuring the landscape in some way. So I think the mist is beautiful, and I love walking when the fields are covered with the mist, as you described, because it in itself is a landscape. It's just vaporous and a kind of translucent because it catches the light, and then something else begins to be revealed, which is the landscape that we're used to seeing, and so there are clearly some veils in the world, and much like the mist, and some of them are pretty thick and dense and obscuring. And so I certainly see that as I travel around the world and read the newspapers and see how much turbulence there is on this planet. And in people's lives, and how much the conventions of the 21st century are affecting people, and not always positively, not always to the good.
Do you think there's a difference between mist and shadows?
I do. I think that there's a real difference, and because the shadows don't dissipate in quite the same way as the mist. They take another kind of work and another kind of effort.
So, Saki, where do we have our existential mist and where do we have our existential shadows today?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the as you call it, the existential mist is that we're perhaps in a place in culture and in society where we're beginning to explore what is behind the conventions, what's behind the conditioning, what's behind who or what I think I am, and therefore who and what I think you are, and therefore who and what is us. So I think that there is a gradual investigation of that mist. And then I think the shadow parts are more opaque. They're harder to see in some ways because they're so deeply conditioned, and I think that largely speaking, well, we could probably describe many different shadows. That the central shadow is the kind of reification of me and of what I want and who I am and how that should in some way or often does dominate you, take priority over you. And so we get a world where there's a lot of greed, a lot of self-centeredness, and it's not very beautiful for all of us, because we all see that it has a tremendous limitation, and it cuts us off from what is probably the most deep, luminous, and bright in every one of us.
Do you think that it's also possible to talk of systemic shadows?
I do. I think that there are cultural and systemic shadows, and they come from kind of the DNA of the culture, and the DNA of the all of the conditioning that has occurred across generations and generations, and then all of a sudden we wake up one day in the 21st century and say, well, this is the way it is. And what I'm interested in is the way all around the world people are beginning to challenge the view of this is the way it is. It may be this is the way it is, but it isn't the way it has to be, and it also isn't the way it is in its depth. It's kind of the same as, we appear to be in a lot of conflict, but human beings essentially have survived because we're cooperative. We're social beings. And that's really the only way to survive well, is to be in relationship with one another in new ways. So I do think there are cultural shadows, and I think that they have to be, if you will, taken back. The depth psychologists would say we have to eat our own shadow and then metabolize it in some way. Jung would have said the same thing, essentially. He did say the same thing, and then we're free of it. We're free of its hidden effects upon us, because we become awake to it and aware of it in a new way that makes it workable, and therefore we can negotiate in some way a new way of being in relationship with it. And probably, at least I'd say, it begins to lose its strength because it's built on convention.
Saki, this summer I went to New York with my family, and
New York City,
yeah. And of course, it was a little of a shock, coming here from the countryside to middle. But then we went to a shop while my wife and daughter, they were shopping for clothes. I spoke to the young shop assistant, a very nice young girl, and I asked her what she liked about New York. Oh, she said, I love the food. I said, well, what do you like about the food? I love McDonald's. So in a way, her vision of the best of life was to go to McDonald's. But then at the same time, she told me she had never been outside New York, or rarely been outside New York. She had 1 week of vacation every year. And I thought, wow, what a life. And we started to speak to one another, and slowly it was as if there was this longing that was born in her. A longing for change.
For a bigger horizon.
For bigger horizons.
Yeah.
I often think, why do we somehow, like this shop assistant, stay inside the shadows of whatever systems we are born into, or whatever conditions we are born into?
So I'm interested in that too. I'm also interested in maybe I'm even more interested in what is it that gets us out?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I can really only speak about that to my own life. Pretty soon the conventions start to feel too narrow, and they become constraining in some ways. At least I can say for myself, that's one of the conditions that got me looking and wondering. And I'd say that I'm not sure that the culture inspires people enough to actually move beyond the immediate limited. I think it tries in some ways. I think the messages from the culture, you're talking about American culture at this moment, suggests, well, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And in some cases, that's probably true. Or there's actually many examples of that. And in other cases, it's not so true at all, because the culture itself constrains us, and it sets the limit, and it sets the boundary about how far out you could walk, so to speak, into your life. So I love that you actually then engaged with her in a conversation, and that all of a sudden something woke up in her, and you called it longing. And I think there's a really interesting word because we confuse it with desire.
Yeah.
And desire is really, at least as I understand it, the wanting of something that I think will give me happiness.
That I can possess.
And I can possess it. And it's like a new car. And then, it gives you pleasure, and then it gets the first dent, and it gives you pain. And then you sort of, it becomes just another tool. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe, you have to have the dent fixed, and it has to be repainted because it has to remain the same. Whereas longing, as far as I know it myself, I can only long, or we can only long for what we already are. And so it's a kind of nostalgia for what's so. And it sounds like in some ways you touched that part of her that has that sense of how big she might actually really be. That life isn't confined to New York or 1 week out a year or the same food. And that's I think the awakening of that longing in people is so essential.
Well, what would make that longing wake up in yourself, Saki?
Well, I think many things. So one thing is, if I sort of think about my life chronologically, I'd say pain.
Pain.
Suffering of a certain kind, of feeling those constraints, of feeling that sense of something isn't quite right. And I don't know what it is, but I know it's not quite right. And so that sort of kicked off a search for what would make it right. And how would I re-perceive a certain kind of rightness inside myself that would feel authentic, real, capable of being lived into. Because ultimately that's the only thing that you can trust is what you've touched, what you've tasted. So that definitely has done that for me, and it's not ended. But it's not the same as it was. It's like, it's not so much searching as in how would I say it? If you're sailing and you sight the North Star, you don't have to keep looking for it. You just have to sail towards it, or let it be your navigational point. And so that's how it feels to me these days, is I'm not searching for the North Star. It's that I'm much more interested now in the way the North Star unfolds me and how I unfold into whatever that represents inside of me.
But the idea of a longing unfolding who you actually are,
Yes,
also in a way poses the question: Do you ever find out who you are?
well, I don't know the ultimate. I don't know the ultimate answer to that, which would be theoretical and somewhat abstract. But if you're asking me, is it possible to discover more and more of what we are? The answer is absolutely yes. And that isn't a belief.
And it's a continual journey.
And it's a continual journey because it's just like sailing again. You sail to the horizon, and when you get there, what is there? The next horizon. And so it's kind of unfolding. I think recently I heard an interesting interview on the radio with some physicists who said, even not very many years ago, like a decade ago or less, we thought there was a boundary to the universe. Like, how could it keep expanding? And now he said, there's no boundary. It just is expanding. Now, the rational mind can't hold that because we always are thinking of beginning, middle, end. But some part of us can absolutely hold it, and not only hold it. My experience is that when I'm able to live into it, it's ecstatic and awe-provoking, and in that sense carries me forward on the journey.
Without ending.
Without ending.
Yeah. Now, you see, I have a picture here. I often bring pictures into to the room, and this picture is taken by my good friend Peter Williams, and you see two boys in a very poor environment sitting over their school journals and not looking that enthusiastic somehow. Yeah. But when I look at the picture, I just have this feeling of how to wake them up to life. I mean, how do we wake our children? How do we wake one another up? How do we make this awakening into the longing, into the journey?
Yeah. You're asking me how to do that?
Yeah, well, yes.
You help people become curious. You wonder out loud with them. You use the very common realities of everyday life as they're perceived through our senses as a way of beginning to reinvigorate the sense of wonder and curiosity, and when that's awakened, at least in my experience, then the investigative capabilities just are somehow catalyzed, and then that leads to more understanding, and then more questions, and more exploration, and more understanding. And I don't know that I hope that never stops in my life, and it surely hasn't stopped in the lives of people that we really admire. I mean, it didn't ever stop, it seems, in Einstein's life. Well, at some point, I guess he got stubborn about about quantum mechanics.
He wasn't that curious about that.
He didn't get so curious about it, but largely he was a pretty curious guy. And look what happened out of it. And so I think that's part of it as well. I think one of the big cultural shadows, maybe, returning to that, is we're a lot more interested in the answers than we are interested in the questions. And I think that stifles those boys who are studying in that picture. If the answers are important, there's no doubt about it. If you're a physician and you got to know the answer to how do I fix a broken leg, or lance an abscess, or whatever it is that you do. You have to know that, and someone has to test you on it, and that's a good thing, and that's a kind of acquisitional part of the learning process that we've gotten really good at, and it does rely on producing the answer. But there's a whole other kind of learning that is not acquired, or I should say, another kind of intelligence, as the poet and Sufi teacher Rumi would say. It's another kind of intelligence, and he says that one's already complete, and it isn't written on any tablet, and so it seems to me that that's part of being willing to live inside not knowing, being willing to live inside the questions. Because when I've reflected on my own life, the only thing really that's supercharged my education, if you will, over time, I don't mean my formal education, and even there, is what I didn't know, and what I wanted to know.
But, I mean, as all things, this curiosity, of course, also has two sides. I mean,
at least two.
I'm thinking that, the other day, actually the day before yesterday, I had a visit of an old friend of mine who's retired, and he has got a good pension. So he was telling me where he was traveling, and he, every second or third week he was going to something new that he wanted to discover and to find out. He was curious. And he's a really, really nice person and did that out of a good, curious heart. And then in the same time, this morning, I had this report telling that there is a 5% chance that by the year 2100 we will all be extinct because the climate temperature raises above 5 degrees. So in a way, I also ask myself, how do we control our unlimited curiosity or our unlimited movement to expansion somehow? Because we are facing a time where that is one of the big questions. We cannot continue the way we live.
Right. Well, I don't know if that's driven by curiosity, the drive for expansion, or if it's driven by greed, or a certain kind of ignorance. Yeah. So I think it's deeply embedded now, almost in our cultural DNA, that capitalism, which is always relying on expansion, is a kind of mirror of the natural world, and therefore of our relative existence. Yeah. Well, it's just not. I mean, if you look at the natural world, it's creative, it's expansive, it's limiting, it's rebalancing. And what we're discovering in the context that you just described of climate change is that we've actually affected the systems adjusting themselves, because we've created conditions where that kind of innate balance built into virtually millions upon years of evolution is now being affected by us. And I'm not sure it's because of our unbridled curiosity or our unbridled sense of I can do whatever I want, so to speak, and there'll be no consequences of it. And if there are, somebody else will fix it. I think that takes us right back around to what we were talking about earlier in terms of what's the deep shadow. And the deep shadow is that it's all about me. It's all about what I want, and how I'm going to get it, and that's just, if you read the so-called tea leaves, that's not working anymore. But we're caught in that view. That's a big shadow, because to get out of the view, we'd have to turn and look in the mirror and say, that's not working anymore.
But if I take and turn it around and look into the mirror, contemplating what is the situation that we are facing, looking at the daily reports of climate change, looking at the heat, the tornadoes or whatever, then I will face fear. I will face a broken heart, in a way, a sadness that is so big that it is hard to contain in a moment. I will maybe also confront shame. How to deal with these emotions? Once I look at the situation of the world, and I turn the mirror around, and I see my part of it.
Yeah, and of course, that's both an individual and a communal work. We might also find relief in that turning toward, if we were doing it collectively. Because if we turned toward it collectively, we'd also probably realize that it isn't up to me to solve the whole problem, but it's up to us. And there's a lot of strength in us. I mean, I'm totally convinced that 7 billion people could figure it out if we put our will to it. I mean, look the history of the world says that all the time. Look how often huge populations have galvanized. Look what happened in World War II. You know, certainly millions upon millions of people died, but also hundreds of millions of people said, "This shall not stand." And we figured out across culture, race, ethnicity, all those differences, a way to, we found a common ground and a common cause and a vision for a different kind of world. And so I have a lot of optimism about the human capacity to do that. And I also know that it also relies on each person in some way saying, okay, I do have some responsibility. And for me, I think you're talking about the interface of two things, Anders. One is consciousness, this capacity for us to know and to understand what is being seen. And the other is conscience. And they're completely interdependent, because essentially if you start to see more clearly and are more aware and awake, it begins to shape your values. And if it begins to shape your values and then you reprioritize, you begin to make sacrifices. And in service of those values, and you take responsibility. And you know, we can all take responsibility for the whole, but we're going to take responsibility for the whole in small parts, each one of us. So I think that has happened in the world, and I think it can continue to happen in the world, and somehow or other, if we were all a little ashamed, we probably would hold it very differently than if it was just about my shame or your shame, or my guilt or your guilt. We'd say, hey, we were blind, we were ignorant, which is really what those things are about. And now our eyes are open, so let's approach this in a new way. And I think that that's happening in a lot of places on the planet.
But in this turning, I think that a lot of us have to face, you know, these very deep emotions, emotion of fear, emotion of shame.
I agree.
And in a way also dare to break the heart, to find your heart-breaking point into to meeting the state of the world. And this process, of course, can be a difficult process. I mean, this is not easy.
It is a difficult process, and it's also an enlivening process. And I think we largely focus on the I wouldn't call it the negative side. I'd say we focus on the side that is filled with fear, naturally, you know, because we want to survive and we want to be intact. And I think in part what you're pointing at requires a certain kind of training. A certain kind of discipline, a certain kind of learning. And of course, as you and I have spoken about, I'm not suggesting mindfulness is the only way to do that. It is a way to do that. And I think if you think about mindfulness in a universal sense, all of the wisdom traditions of the world have taught people something about how do we face our fear? How do we use the fear that we confront? How do we not get paralyzed by it, but instead somehow use it like wind in our sails to propel us without denying it, and yet without somehow becoming imprisoned by it as if that's all we are. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if we look at our fear, well, what's doing the looking? Not the fear. Some other other aspect of what it means to be a human being. If we look at our shame and are able to somehow feel it and observe it, then we already know there's something larger than our shame that's capable of, in quotes, holding that as in embracing it, understanding it, meeting it with some level of truthfulness and care or kindness, and then we start to become freed of it. I also don't think we have to break our hearts. I think if we open up, our hearts just get broken. And I think our fear is that they'll just get broken, and my experience is they get broken open. And when they get broken open, there's more room to hold what is felt. So I think part of what you're pointing at is, how do we as human beings begin to become comfortable with our discomfort when we feel uncomfortable? How as human beings to begin to become comfortable with the sense of vulnerability? Because we largely attach to it weakness rather than see it also as a strength. I mean, when you think about it, we're looking at it, these fields and hills here, they're exposed all day. Cold, heat, rain, wind, you know, and somehow or other, they look pretty vibrant.
Yeah, they do. That's true.
And alive. And not only that, they're sustaining us. Food is coming out of them, and wood for houses and heat. And so somehow or other, I think the natural world is suggesting to us all the time that this openness to the way things are isn't necessarily we're not impoverished by it, but we may actually discover it's quite the opposite.
I've read somewhere that you said the doing is in the being.
Yes.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, so remember how a little while ago we were talking about intelligence that is acquired and intelligence that is complete? So those would be like doing and being. So, you know, to acquire something, any kind of skill, we have to practice it. It takes effort. It takes, you know, getting up and, you know, going to the piano and playing horribly for a while as we begin to play better, or learning any skill, a language. It is a doing kind of thing that involves effort, will, persistence, the ability to feel I'm not making progress, even as progress is slowly unfolding. So, and a lot of what we see in our world is the outcome of doing. It, beautifully so. Architecture, buildings, music, fine art. Somebody did those. Somebody produced this rug we're looking at in your studio. They did it to do. There's this other dimension of being a human being that I think Rumi's pointing at. I know actually, in that already complete, which is that that's the being part of us. Like, we're called human beings because we actually have some knowing about that part of us that simply is. That isn't attached to what I do. And experience tells me that if I'm driven by what I do, I'm never satisfied in the end, because it never fully fulfills the contentment. I always have to get ready to do the next thing. And in my work in medicine across 35, almost 40 years really, I've seen the same thing over and over again. A lot of the stress that people describe in their lives is the feeling that they can't stop, that every doing, even when it's accomplished, isn't completely satisfying. And so they set themselves up for the next one. And that one's not quite fully satisfying. It's very temporarily satisfying. and that sets you up for the next one. Well, that's pretty much like being on a wheel, like a rat.
Yeah.
And, you know, I once heard Lily Tomlin, the great American comedian, say, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat.
Yeah.
And a lot of wisdom in that comedic line, in the sense of, what happens if we step off the wheel? I mean, this is what happens in those fields. In the winter, they're going to go fallow. They're not going to grow. And we accept that. We accept in the winter that the trees are not going to do photosynthesis in the same way. It's okay. We accept that there's a time of the year, if you're a hunter, that you shouldn't hunt the deer, because if you do, there won't be any deer. But we have a hard time with that in ourselves. We don't really easily any longer listen to the rhythms of our own lives. Night does come. It used to really settle us in a rural environment, because
Now we turn on the light.
exactly.
Yeah.
Then you couldn't do anything much, you know. Now you turn on the light, you can turn on the computer, you can turn on the music, you can stimulate yourself forever. And I'm not, I like all of that.
Yeah.
It's not like it's a bad thing, but what it really suggests is that we're now more responsible than ever.
Yeah.
Because nature's not going to drive the rhythm. We have to take.
We have to take responsibility.
Yeah,
for
we
the
have to take responsibility for it, and that means beginning to reckon with there are moments of doing and there are moments of being. There are moments of activity. There are moments of repose, and the world is really, I think, out of balance in that way, because we so much emphasize the activity side and very little the repose part.
Is there a relationship between being and empathy, or I could ask in another way? You have some places talked about how mindfulness and the cultivation of empathy, they are related.
Yes, I do think they're related, and so my sense is this. My experience is this, that is, you begin to become awake to some of those aspects of experience that you described a little while ago in oneself. I think the fear in the culture is that would make us more narcissistic. We'd just be then more driven.
So, yeah.
We'd become more selfish. My experience is that as I become more sensitized to those places in me, and I don't just mean the, in quotes, the emotions of fear or greed or whatever, but also a whole range of emotions, including happiness, joy, that has seemingly no object. We begin to actually realize that you feel the same things. That, you know, human beings have 1,000 different expressions, in what we call the content of our lives. Like, I don't live in this environment, you do. So that's content. But if I ask you, how is it for you when your daughter falls? You feel the same way that I feel. We basically ache the same way. We feel happiness for many of the same reasons. We feel elation for some of the mainly the same reasons. Awe, wonder, grief. So as I become more sensitized to those in me, it doesn't make me more narcissistic or selfish. It allows me to begin to understand you, sometimes with words, but often without. And my own experience is that begins to soften me, and not weaken me, but soften me, so that I'm more capable of feeling in relationship with you. And what mindfulness is about, really, if you boil it down to a single word, is about relationship or relationality. And from my book, that's really what the book is about. How shall I be in relationship to myself? How shall I be in relationship to the people I call patients or participants? How shall I be in relationship to the people around me, my family, my colleagues, my friends, the people that hurt me or I have hurt? How shall I be in relationship to the larger world, including the institution in which I work and the world in which that exists? Then I think there's a resonance that begins to arise, and that's, I believe, what we call empathy. And I believe that my experience is that sympathy, empathy, mercy, kindness, they're all part of this same human capacity to feel.
In a world that we have sort of talked about with big problems, but also with children with problems in their life and so on. I mean, there are lots of things that calls upon us, and one of the, for me, key questions is how do we turn our empathy of being into a moment of doing. In the Buddhist tradition, you have this beautiful picture of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Out of the tears of Avalokiteshvara is Tara born, a Bodhisattva that has a lot to do with change. So I'm very interested in this creation or this birth of what makes change from feeling, from empathy, from inner being, and into actually doing something. Because often it is difficult to get out of your meditation cushion and actually do something, because it is it is often inconvenient to do things.
It's challenging.
It's challenging and inconvenient.
Well, I love that question, because it's not all happening on the cushion.
No.
That may be a useful laboratory. In fact, it is a useful laboratory, but it's just that. It's not like the world doesn't exist when I'm on the cushion or when I get off the cushion. And so I'm interested in what's my responsibility as a human being. And if I ask myself, what's my responsibility, and even more closely, what's been entrusted to me, because everybody's entrusted with something, actually with many things. If you have a child, that child is entrusted to you, and it's your job to do something and take care of them, as well as to be with them. And so I think that those two dynamics are working all the time. And at least for me, it seems to me that the meditation is only useful because it's useful in my everyday life. And not just because it makes me somehow more special, but because it allows me to actually be in relationship to the world and ask myself those very questions that you're posing. What's mine to do? How shall I begin? What will I do, even in the smallest of instances? It doesn't have to be something big. It's that's what the world needs now. The world needs more people that say, the way that the meditation really expresses itself for most of us in the world is in action. I've always been struck by, Dag Hammarskjöld saying that in our age, the road to holiness is the road of action. And that in some way or other, he saw that really clearly, that, and he exemplified it. He may have been one of the great diplomats of his time in terms of how he worked with very critical situations during the 60s and as the head of the UN. And I think he was a meditator or a deeply spiritual man who realized, I do have responsibility for the world. We don't have to be the head of the UN to have that same feeling. I think we just have to really begin to ask ourselves, what is entrusted to me? What are my charges? What am I charged with taking care of in my home, in myself, in the environment around me? And if everybody did that, we'd see a lot of shift.
Do you think that feeling of, you could say, also responsibility is a part of man's inherent nature, or original nature, or is it something to be cultivated?
I think it's both.
It's both.
I think it's like virtually everything else, that it's innate, but it might lay dormant. And our work is to move it from latency to actuality. And so it's like compassion may be innate, but it needs to be attended to for it to be activated and then to show up in the world. So I don't think it's just one or the other. I think that there's a kind of labor that's involved in moving from the sense of feeling to the sense of, and then how would I reach out to the world with that, through that same quality.
So does that indicate that, or implicate that using mindfulness as a path, in a way, for that potential to unfold, also requires a society or upbringing or whatever with ethical, moral values? What is the correlation between, mindfulness as a path and the reality, in a way, meeting mindfulness? Is my process as a person practicing mindfulness, is that different whether I am somebody practicing mindfulness coming out of a very religious and pious and family of tradition of doing good, or I do practice mindfulness as a stockbroker coming out of a family and tradition where the primary aim is to earn money?
The realities of the world and mindfulness are not different. So that's a false duality. I think in a very real way, it's just like what's happening inside of you or I isn't separate from what's seemingly happening outside of you and I. Those are comfortable segmentations and separations, and the discursive mind loves them, or is at least familiar with them. Black, white, night, day, yes, no, good, bad. And there's some real value in ascertaining some of that accurately. But it's not the whole story. So if you're asking me, could you be a stockbroker and be mindful? And not just mindful of how to make more money. Because mindfulness is innately, there's always one additive, and that's goodness. Wholesomeness, it's called. And so, people often give the example, well, a sniper has to pay very close attention. That's a characteristic of mindfulness. The sniper has to be purposeful and deliberate. The sniper has to gather her or his mind and direct it. And then the sniper has to complete an action using all of those qualities. Is the sniper mindful? I don't think so. I think the sniper may be very attentive, but mindfulness isn't just about attention. It's about clear seeing. It's about comprehending. It's about recognizing that there are causes and effects, and in some very real way beginning to train ourselves to not do harm, to reckon with what is actually right, what's often called right action, or wholesome action that somehow or other is sustainable rather than somehow destructive. That's not an easy path
No.
for any of us, because we start to discover all of the ways even our good intentions lead to harm inadvertently. We don't mean it,
No.
but it happens. And so I think our capacity to begin to understand that and see that, and I mean more than intellectually, but at a deep level of feeling it and feeling those moments, begins to cultivate a certain kind of wisdom in us, or understanding. And then our actions begin to perhaps unfold in different ways, or we're more careful. We're more attentive to not doing harm, and if we're fortunate enough, maybe doing a little good. So I've met stockbrokers who are incredibly mindful, and I don't mean mindful as in the way of the sniper, but they are incredibly skillful at making money. They're also incredibly skillful at directing that money towards good causes. And I know a few of those people just like that. They've used the skill because that capital is necessary. I mean, we want to create villages with clean water and sanitation and good schools in our countries or in another country where people are impoverished. Those skills are tremendously valuable for that to happen. And I've also met people who claim to be mindful that are pretty blind. And, you know, your viewers are looking at one of them. How many moments have I thought I was being mindful when I was just causing havoc in my own life, my own family? And that's when the mirror needs to turn so that you can see it, understand it, honor it in some way, not deny it, and also not get flattened, if you will, by it, but instead be catalyzed to, in some way, make a shift.
But Saki, does this bring a spiritual, a religious dimension into what you call mindfulness here? I mean, because when you speak to me, it sounds very much as speaking from in a way, a religious foundation or religious system where there is a precondition of something good being present, or something pointing towards the goodness. I mean, the distinction between being attentive and being mindful, does that imply a kind of a spiritual religious dimension being present?
Well, I'd say that you'd have to say more about what you meant by, in quotes, spiritual, and what you meant by, in quotes, religious. So most of us in the West have been brought up in a religious tradition that would actually suggest that instead of that we're stained with what we call original sin. And so we've done bad from the start. What if you discovered that there's a basic goodness inside of you as well?
But this is also in the same tradition. What is said when you are born you're made created in the image of God.
Right, but
I mean this is what I mean with, you know, in Buddhism you talk about the Buddha nature being in people. In at least some part of Christianity you talk about Christ being you being shaped in the image of Christ,
Right.
and in Hinduism you talk about the Atman Brahman, being in a unity. So in a way you point towards a deeper reality inside a person in various religions.
Yes.
And my question is, in a way, that when you describe mindfulness as you did before,
Yes.
isn't that taking mindfulness as a system, as a method, from one place into sort of the more religious sphere?
It might. Well, I think there's a distinction that's probably worth talking about. Largely speaking, the contemplative traditions don't suggest that you have to believe something in advance. So there isn't a dogma associated with it, and that's as true in Christianity as is true in Buddhism or any other, or Hinduism. That doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of system, as you described it, available, but the invitation is more like this. Let's enter into an experiment. And you be the laboratory, and you be the experimenter, and you be the experiment, and you be the data. And you don't have to believe anything in advance, but the invitation is to have an open enough mind that you could actually read the data when it's being produced, and then reflect on the data. And in that way, it doesn't force you to believe something until there is some understanding that flowers out of your own experience. And I think ultimately that surely was the message of Jesus. Don't hold your light under a basket. That's saying the light is innate. It's not saying I have the light. It's don't hold your light under a basket. And or be a light unto yourself. That same message in the Buddhist tradition. Well, that means that there's already a light, but it's not good enough to think it. It needs to be discovered. So if you're asking me about mindfulness and its relationship to those systems, there is surely a relationship, but it's one that invites discovery rather than only belief. Now, of course, there is a measure of faith that's required, for sure. And I think that faith changes over time. It probably begins as one way and it turns into something else, maybe something that's beyond belief and becomes conviction, because it's so out of your own experience and you actually know it. So sometimes, Anders, I wonder about the word spirituality, not because I don't believe it doesn't exist, because I believe it does exist, and I believe we long for it, whatever that means. What I'm hesitant often about is that it means so many different things to so many people. And so while on one hand it could be valuable because it's non-specific, it's kind of like the word stress. It's hard to define it scientifically, but if you ask anybody in the world what it is, they know what it is personally. So I think it's that way for spirituality, and unfortunately what happens is it becomes dividing. It's like your spirituality is different than mine, and mine happens to be better than yours, or your God is not my God, except all of them are saying there's only a single reality. So how could that be? And so maybe part of what's evolving for us is we're also grappling with what does it mean to be a human being? And while that word spiritual has some not quite definable, but we understand it in some way, personally. Value, so it may have some value that way. Not so useful if it divides us. I'd rather call it something else. I'm not sure what that is, except maybe humanity, or our shared humanity. I'm not even sure that's adequate so I don't know the name. I know what that name or that word is pointing at. But it has its dangerous side because it does do so much dividing. I mean, you and I and your listeners know this, how many wars have been fought in the name of your God, my God, your spirituality, my spirituality. So it may be that in part, just the way we're beginning to grapple as a world or a planet, because we're not the world, with a planet, with what's our universal responsibility as human beings. I mean, this is an amazing place. Yeah. And you know, we're not all going to Mars. So how are we gonna fix it? Maybe we're also beginning to discover what's the universal nature of whatever this word spirituality is pointing at, and how does it express itself differently because of different cultures and contexts, and yet what's the universal message behind that? That seems to me to be one of the great koans or puzzles or quests. It's a kind of odyssey in our time, because we already know that the dividing stuff doesn't work. It just doesn't work.